Undercover CEO finds out his hardest working employee is homeless. His response is unbelievable. Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe, as we upload at the same time every day. Ethan Carter's heart pounded the moment he saw the bright lights of the call center, a place that was supposedly the nucleus of his massive tech enterprise. He'd been in disguise countless times for marketing research, but never like this. This time, he was going undercover to examine whether his own company was failing its employees on the inside. Right away, something felt off. Instead of the usual hum of chatter and efficient calls, there was an air of fatigue gripping the night shift. People slumped in cubicles, too tired even to properly greet the new guy. In his simple polo shirt and worn jeans, Ethan introduced himself as Eli, a new hire looking to learn the ropes of customer support. He had no idea his first interaction would trigger a series of events that would lead to exposing not just an overworked staff, but also a hardworking man who was secretly homeless. Within minutes, the first red flag soared high when Ethan noticed a young man huddling in a corner, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and his uniform shirt wrinkled as if it had been worn for days. This man's name was James, and his desk was the only one stacked with blankets and a small toiletry bag. Instead of finishing a call and clocking out, James lingered well past the end of his shift. There was something deeply troubling about how James avoided leaving the building, as though stepping outside was far scarier than any workload in front of him. Ethan scanned his ID badge from a distance. James had been with the company for years, racking up record-breaking stats in call times and customer satisfaction, and yet no one seemed to even notice he was still there long after hours. The manager on duty, Doug, barked orders at the employees like they were robots, ignoring them as people. The tension in the air was thick, and Ethan quickly realized that Doug's presence loomed over the entire floor like a storm cloud about to burst. When Ethan awkwardly approached Doug to ask about training protocols for new hires, he was greeted with a dismissive, "Figure it out yourself, or ask that guy, James," since he apparently has nowhere else to be. The sarcasm cut like a knife. To see a manager treat an employee with such blatant disrespect pushed Ethan's patience to the edge, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed concrete evidence to ensure he wasn't just reacting impulsively. He'd built Carter Tech Solutions from the ground up, priding himself on a workplace culture that valued each individual. If it turned out that the reality was far uglier, he needed to handle it thoughtfully. That first night, Ethan observed James from a distance. After the final calls trickled in, James stayed behind. There were no more tasks left for him. The phones were silent, yet he remained, fiddling nervously with something on his desk. Finally, as the clock neared midnight, James took a deep breath, glanced around to ensure no one was watching, and slipped a small blanket over his shoulders. Ethan's eyes widened. This wasn't just exhaustion. James wasn't leaving because, quite simply, he had nowhere to go. The truth stung Ethan's conscience. A man who was clearly giving everything to the company had been left behind in every sense of the word. It became Ethan's mission from that moment on to uncover why. He ran through a million possibilities in his head. Maybe James had a long commute and was waiting for a morning bus. Maybe he was saving money for rent and didn't want to waste gas. But the presence of that blanket, the set of toiletries by the keyboard, and the vacant expression on James's face didn't suggest a temporary arrangement. It looked permanent. Ethan felt torn between his desire to intervene immediately and his need to maintain cover. If he confronted James right away, it might tip off Doug or alert others that something unusual was happening. Worse, it could embarrass James. So Ethan decided to lie low, watch carefully, and see if the evidence continued to mount. He wanted to be absolutely sure of what he was seeing. A top performer, stuck on the night shift, forced to use a cubicle as a makeshift home. The possibility alone made Ethan's stomach churn. He'd always promised himself he'd never let exploitation or cruelty infect his organization. But here it was, staring him in the face on his very first night undercover. With a deep breath, Ethan walked away, letting James be for the moment, determined to find out how far this rabbit hole went and how many other employees were suffering in silence. He was going to come back tomorrow better prepared, with questions, with a plan, and a steeled resolve to confront whatever injustice was unfolding under his very own roof. The next day, Ethan returned, fully immersed in the role of Eli, the humble new hire. He made small talk with co-workers, gleaning bits of information on how the call center functioned under Doug's iron fist. Sure enough, many of them whispered about unmanageable workloads, minimal breaks, and snide remarks from management. But all of that paled in comparison to what they subtly hinted at. James was always there. He arrived before everyone else, left after everyone else, if he left at all. Most assumed he was simply that dedicated. But Ethan suspected they knew more. Whenever the topic got too close to James's situation, people abruptly changed the subject or glossed over details, like they were afraid of being overheard. Doug made an appearance, prowling the rows of desks like a wolf looking for prey. He would stand behind unsuspecting employees, arms crossed, scanning their screens to catch any mistakes. If he saw a typo or a hesitation in responding to a client, he'd make a snide remark. "We're not paying you to play. Stay focused or go home if you can't handle it." The words "go home" felt like daggers for James, who sat stoically at his station. Ethan watched as James typed away, answering queries with remarkable speed. His face was set in a mask of cool professionalism, but there was an undercurrent of exhaustion in his eyes that no mask could hide. During lunch hour, if you could, call 15 minutes a lunch. Ethan tried to approach James, offering to buy him a coffee from the vending machine. James declined with a polite, almost forced smile. "No thanks," he muttered quietly. "I'm not much of a coffee guy." Something in his tone suggested more than mere preference. Ethan pressed gently. "You sure? I could grab you a snack if coffee's not your thing." James's shoulders tensed. "I'm good, man," he insisted, turning back to his screen. Still, Ethan saw the flicker of embarrassment cross James's face. A flash of vulnerability that all but screamed he couldn't afford anything extra. Desperate to keep the conversation going, Ethan asked, "So, how long have you been at Carter Tech?" Without turning around, James replied, 3 years in customer support. Ever since I lost my previous job and needed something steady." The tension in his voice made it clear he didn't want to share details. Doug's sudden arrival caused them both to snap back to attention. "Break's over, ladies," he barked, glancing from Ethan to James with contempt. "If you want to chat like best friends, do it on your own time." Ethan felt anger roil in his stomach, but he forced himself to keep calm. He had to see where this led. After lunch, Ethan kept an eye on James, noticing how meticulously he handled calls. He never complained, never seemed to falter, but the weariness in his posture told a different story. When the shift ended and employees trickled out of the office, Ethan lingered. He saw James linger too, pretending to shuffle papers, log out of systems, and do menial tasks. No one questioned him, not even Doug, though Ethan caught the manager looking at James with a sneer that hinted at a twisted satisfaction. Perhaps Doug enjoyed the power trip of making James stay. Maybe he got off on the knowledge that James couldn't leave even if he wanted to. As the clock ticked later into the night, the overhead lights dimmed to energy-saving mode. The hush that fell over the call center made every tap on the keyboard sound thunderous. Finally, James stood, gave a quick glance to confirm he was alone, and pulled out the blanket once again. Ethan watched from the shadows, heart racing. It was official. James was using the office as his home. He sank into his chair, then slowly laid his head on the desk. The loneliness of that moment hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He realized this man had probably been doing this for months, maybe longer, slipping through the cracks of a system that didn't care about him. Here was a top performer, arguably the hardest working person on the team, reduced to living among cubicles and computers. That knowledge felt like a betrayal of everything Ethan believed in. Resolving to talk to James directly, Ethan decided to approach him after a bit of time had passed. But just as he worked up the courage and stepped forward, the lights flicked back on. Doug's voice sliced through the stillness. "What the hell are you still doing here?" He stomped across the floor to James, who jolted awake, eyes wide, with terror at being caught. Doug's fury radiated. Are you sleeping on company property? You want to get us sued if you slip in the bathroom next. We can't have that kind of liability, James stammered, trying to stand. I was just finishing some work. I must have dozed off. Doug chuckled darkly. Right, because you're such a dedicated employee. Why don't you take your sleeping bag and get lost? For a moment, James looked like he might argue. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and let his eyes drop to the floor. Doug leaned in, voice low, a sneer twisting his lips. Don't test me. I could fire you right now for violating policy. Or would you rather I just call security and have them escort you out? Ethan clenched his fists, willing himself not to blow his cover just yet. He needed more than a single incident to confront Doug properly. He needed a pattern, something that would ensure Doug could never weasel his way out of accountability. As Doug retreated to his office, slamming the door behind him, James stood, trembling. Feeling more certain than ever that this was bigger than a single manager's power trip, Ethan resolved to step in soon. He would not stand by while a man like Doug threatened a loyal employee's livelihood. But the time had to be right. Only then could Ethan deliver justice in a way that would send a clear message to anyone who dared exploit the people who made this company thrive. The next morning, Ethan made a plan to talk to James one-on-one in a safe environment. He waited by the parking lot, but James never emerged. Puzzled, Ethan tried again the following day, arriving extra early. This time, he caught James stepping out of an old, battered car, one that had obviously seen better days. The minute James noticed Ethan, he froze, as if he'd been caught doing something shameful. Ethan offered a disarming smile and casually said, "Hey, morning." James looked around nervously. "Morning. I wanted to see if we could get breakfast before our shift," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. "I've got some gift cards, and I could really use company." James hesitated. I'm not hungry." It was a transparent lie, but Ethan didn't push. Instead, he tried a softer tactic. "How about a coffee, or even just a place to sit down? I know a cafe around the corner that's got decent Wi-Fi if you want to check your messages." James let out a quiet sigh, the kind that told Ethan he was tired of making excuses. Finally, he agreed. They ended up at a small cafe, nearly empty at that hour. Over the hum of a ceiling fan, Ethan carefully approached the subject of living, arrangements. "How long's your commute?" he asked innocently. James shrugged. "I don't live far." "That's good," Ethan replied. "It's rough driving in the city. Traffic's insane." An uncomfortable silence settled as Ethan recognized James wouldn't volunteer the truth easily. The topic shifted to general workplace chatter, and eventually, with enough gentle nudging, James confessed that he'd been facing financial hardship for a while. He didn't outright say he was homeless, but the details he offered painted a grim picture. Expenses had piled up after a family emergency, and he'd lost his apartment when his lease ended. With nowhere else to go, he'd started crashing in his car and, when possible, inside the office. Ethan felt an ache in his chest. Even though he already suspected this, hearing it confirmed made it painfully real. After finishing their coffees, Ethan had discreetly paid. James mumbled a thanks and headed back to his car for a moment, presumably to collect himself. That day, Ethan watched James at work with renewed empathy, noticing how he never spent a dime on snacks, never brought anything fancy for lunch, and often stayed well past the time everyone else had gone home. Meanwhile, Doug continued his tyrannical reign, hovering, criticizing, occasionally launching into rants about how nobody worked hard enough. Ethan saw employees shrink under Doug's glare, their morale plummeting with each sarcastic remark. The tension between Doug and James intensified. One afternoon, James made a small slip on a call. He put a customer on hold for too long, costing the company a potential sale. Doug exploded. "Unbelievable! You can't even keep track of a simple call? Maybe if you spent less time napping at your desk, you'd do your job right." James, normally so composed, shot back, "I said I was sorry. It's one call. I'm allowed a mistake now and then, right?" The entire floor went silent, eyes darting between Doug and James. Doug took a threatening step forward. "You watch your mouth, or I'll watch your job position evaporate. That's how it works around here. James's face flushed. He mumbled an apology and sank back into his chair. Ethan felt a surge of anger. This was becoming a pattern. Doug pushing employees to breaking point, wielding threats like a weapon. That night, Ethan decided to stay even later, observing from a dark corner. Sure enough, hours after most staff had left, James remained, finishing up calls that had overflowed into the after-hours queue. Once done, he dimmed the screen, stretched, and rubbed his eyes. The building was nearly silent when Doug reappeared, looming over the cubicles. "What are you still doing here?" he demanded. James muttered, "Just, finishing up." Doug snorted. "You know, you've got a real nerve, acting all high and mighty earlier. If I wanted to, I could have you kicked out with one phone call. But then again, where would you go?" James stiffened, eyes filled with hurt pride. "I'd manage." Doug's lips twisted into a cruel grin. "Yeah, right. You'd last a day out there. Sleep in your car, scrounge for your next meal. Oh, wait. That's already your life, isn't it?" That moment shattered the thin veil James had been clinging to. He opened his mouth as though to protest, but no words came out. Doug barked a laugh and turned on his heel, leaving James to stand there, humiliated. In the shadows, Ethan clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. His hands shook with the urge to step in and blow his cover. But if he showed his true identity now, Doug might twist the situation, claim ignorance, or shift blame onto James for violating policy. Ethan wanted to ensure that when he confronted Doug, there would be no escape, no chance for him to manipulate the facts. Still, the sight of James, shoulders slumped in defeat, was almost too much. Ethan promised himself that soon, very soon, he would step forward. And when he did, Doug wouldn't just be scolded. He'd be exposed for the toxic bully he was. Each new day at Carter Tech found Ethan more outraged than the last. He heard whispers of Doug forcing employees to clock out early while still expecting them to finish their tasks, effectively making them work unpaid. He saw how Doug sabotaged certain high-performing individuals who threatened his ego. The man ruled through fear, and the entire department was suffocating under his harsh regime. Yet somehow, James kept producing exceptional results. His performance, metrics were off the charts, his dedication unwavering. But at what cost? His personal life was in tatters, reduced to a humiliating scramble for survival. Late one evening, Ethan caught James pacing by his car, trying to steel himself for another night of cramped sleep. Without hesitation, Ethan walked up. "Hey, I forgot something inside. Want to walk with me?" He said it casually, hoping James would accept and maybe open up a bit more. James shrugged. "Sure," he said, though his tone suggested reluctance. Inside, the building was quiet. Only the faint hum of fluorescent lights accompanied their footsteps. Ethan led James to a small break room. He grabbed 2 bottled waters and offered one. After a long sip, Ethan gently asked, "Why do you let Doug treat you like that?" James stared at the water bottle in his hands, twisting the cap. "Because I need this job." "Can't you file a complaint? Talk to HR?" James scoffed. "HR listens to Doug. He's got connections, friends, in the higher-ups. And even if I did complain, that'd just make me a target. Besides, people like me..." He trailed off, swallowing the rest of the sentence. Ethan caught the meaning. People who have nowhere else to go. People who are desperate. People who can't afford to lose what little they have. The rawness of James's admission stung. Ethan set his jaw, battling the urge to say, "I'm the CEO, and this ends now." But he couldn't yet, not without more evidence, more witnesses. At that moment, a plan began to form in Ethan's mind. He would gather enough proof that Doug was knowingly exploiting James, knowingly allowing him to live in the office while threatening him with termination at every turn. That way, when Ethan finally made his move, Doug wouldn't just be fired, He'd be an example to anyone else in the company who thought it was acceptable to crush the vulnerable for personal gain. They parted ways, James returning to his car and Ethan to his hidden vantage point. With each passing hour, Ethan's resolve hardened. A shift was coming, one that would shake the foundation of this place, and he was determined that James would be the catalyst, not just for his own liberation, but for everyone else trapped under Doug's oppressive rule. In the coming days, Ethan quietly rallied the other employees. During breaks, he'd initiate small conversations about Doug's behavior, carefully steering them to share their experiences. He encouraged them to stand up for one another, to speak out if they saw someone being mistreated. Surprisingly, many employees responded with cautious optimism. They were desperate for change, but felt powerless. The moment they sensed a new hire with a backbone willing to challenge Doug, they began to share stories of withheld pay raises, unfair discipline, and blatant favoritism. Ethan kept careful notes in a small, inconspicuous journal. He documented dates and times of Doug's most egregious behaviors. Meanwhile, James became the focal point of it all. Employees whispered about how talented he was, how he consistently received customer commendations. Yet he never got the promotions he deserved, never received the bonuses others did. Some speculated that Doug felt threatened by James's competence. Others assumed Doug was just picking on someone he perceived as weak. Ethan realized James embodied everything wrong with the situation. A star employee singled out and bullied by a manager, forced to hide the fact that he lived out of his car, with no recourse but to keep his head down. The tension reached a boiling point late one Friday. The call center was short-staffed due to a bug in the scheduling system, and customers flooded the lines. James juggled multiple calls seamlessly, while Doug roamed the floor like a vulture, snapping at anyone who dared pause to catch their breath. At one point, James put a customer on hold to quickly confirm an account detail, and Doug stormed over, demanding to know why the hold time was so long. James tried to explain that the customer had a complicated issue, but Doug wouldn't have it. "You're wasting time. Wrap it up, or I wrap up your employment." Something in James snapped. Ethan watched as James clenched his fists, took a steadying breath, and said in a loud, clear voice, "You know what, Doug? Enough. I'm doing my job here better than you ever acknowledge. Stop threatening me." The entire floor fell eerily silent, the collective tension so thick that Ethan could practically feel everyone's hearts pounding. Doug's face turned a mottled red, and he sputtered, struggling to form coherent words. "How dare you talk to me like that? Who do you think you are?" James pushed back his chair and stood, facing Doug directly. "I'm someone who's tired of your abuse," he said. His voice shook with a mix of fear and determination. "I work harder than anyone here, and you know it. I don't deserve to be treated like garbage." For a heartbeat, it seemed like Doug might actually back down, but the manager's pride wouldn't allow it. He pointed a trembling finger at James. "You want to see how far your bravado gets you, tough guy? You're done. You're fired." A collective gasp swept through the room. The notion that this star employee, who'd arguably been keeping the department afloat, could be tossed aside so callously was almost surreal. James paled, but he kept his gaze steady, refusing to show the fear that gnawed at him. Then, in a cruel twist, Doug added loudly, "And guess what? No more free nights at the office. Looks like you'll have to find a new cardboard box under a bridge somewhere." Employees stared in horror. Some looked ready to speak up, but fear held them back. Ethan felt his blood boil to a degree he'd never experienced before. He considered stepping in right then and there, but something told him the moment wasn't right. He needed a public forum, a meeting or gathering, where everyone could witness the truth, and Doug wouldn't have any room for deniability. In the aftermath, James walked away in a daze. No one dared stop him. Doug remained standing in the middle of the call center, chest heaving, like some victorious alpha wolf. But Ethan noticed the uncertain flicker in Doug's eyes, a momentary recognition that perhaps he'd gone too far. That night, Ethan found James sitting alone in his car, shoulders slumped. Without revealing his identity, he knocked on the window, stepping back as James rolled it down. I'm sorry, Ethan said quietly. That was messed up. James stared at the steering wheel. Now what? He whispered, voice raw. I've got no job, no home, and nowhere else to go. Ethan's heart twisted. He fought the overwhelming urge to confess who he really was, to offer James immediate relief. But he knew that if he revealed his identity at that moment, it would be a band-aid fix, not the sweeping change needed. He needed to handle Doug once and for all. So Ethan swallowed hard and said, "Things aren't always what they seem. Let me try to help, okay? Give me a day or two. Just trust me." James gave a hollow laugh. "Trust you? I don't even know you." But there was a weary acceptance in his eyes. He had no other choice. That weekend, Ethan compiled everything he had. Employee testimonies, logs of Doug's harassment, and the shocking evidence of how James had been living at work. Then he quietly arranged a meeting for the following Monday, making sure not just the entire team but also key members from upper management would be present. This, Ethan knew, was the moment of truth. He intended to walk in as Eli, the new hire, and walk out as Ethan Carter, the CEO, ensuring Doug faced the consequences of his actions in front of everyone he had tormented. It was time to reclaim the soul of Carter Tech, and James's plight was the final push Ethan needed to do it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of the office and hopefully bring the justice James so desperately deserved. Monday arrived with an electric tension crackling in the air. Employees shuffled into the large meeting room, uncertain why they'd all been summoned. Doug prowled near the front, a smug smirk on his face as he chatted with a few upper managers who had come by invitation. No one had seen James yet, and rumor was he had cleared out his desk. Ethan, still dressed in his casual Eli attire, positioned himself near the back of the room, waiting for just the right moment. He clutched the folder containing his evidence, heart pounding like a war drum. At exactly 9 o'clock, an executive vice president, Melissa, stood and called the meeting to order. "We're here today to discuss issues of workplace culture, compliance, and recent allegations of misconduct," she announced, casting a measured glance across the assembled crowd. Doug scoffed loudly. "Misconduct? By whom? We run a tight ship here. The only misconduct I've seen is employees who can't handle a little tough love." Melissa gave him a polite yet skeptical look. "We'll see about that. We've received multiple reports of harassment and unethical behavior within this department. I'd like to invite anyone who feels they have evidence to speak up." Ethan heard his cue. His stomach fluttered, but he steadied himself. In one swift movement, he walked to the front of the room, passing Doug, who snorted in derision at the sight of the new guy, apparently about to voice some complaint. Clutching his folder, Ethan turned to face the crowd. An almost tangible ripple of confusion swept through the room when people saw him standing at the front. Clearing his throat, Ethan began. "My name is Eli. At least, that's what you all know me as. But that's not who I really am." He locked eyes with Doug, whose expression shifted from sneering to perplexed. "My real name," Ethan continued, projecting his voice so all could hear, "is Ethan Carter. I am the CEO of Carter Tech Solutions." A collective gasp ricocheted through the room. Some employees looked shocked. Others showed dawning realization. One or two who had suspected something was off about Eli smirked with a mix of satisfaction and awe. Doug's face went completely slack, his mouth forming an incoherent shape of protest. You can't be—" "That's ridiculous," he stammered, desperately searching for an escape route. The upper managers exchanged startled glances, some nodding as if to confirm Ethan's identity. Melissa looked momentarily taken aback, but then she offered a faint smile of recognition. She had met Ethan before, though apparently not often, enough to recognize him in disguise. Ethan addressed the crowd, raising his voice. "I came here undercover because I wanted to see firsthand how this call center is run. What I found was worse than I could have imagined." He gestured to the employees. "I spoke to many of you. I gathered stories and evidence of verbal abuse, manipulation, and exploitation. And most disturbingly, I discovered that one of our most dedicated employees, James, was living in his car and sometimes sleeping in the office, and no one in leadership did anything to help him. At the mention of James's name, a murmur spread among the employees. Some nodded in sad agreement. Doug tried to interject. "That's not my responsibility. He never said—" Ethan cut him off. "He shouldn't have had to say anything. As a manager, you should have noticed. But instead, I heard from several witnesses that you ridiculed him and threatened to fire him whenever he tried to speak up." Doug's face turned a dangerous shade of red. He sputtered, That's not fair. He was breaking policy, sleeping on company property. I was just enforcing the rules." Ethan stepped closer, eyes burning with controlled fury. "You hid behind policy to bully an employee who was clearly in crisis, and you took pleasure in doing so by all accounts. I have written statements from multiple witnesses detailing how you humiliated him, and I have the time logs showing how often you forced him to work overtime off the clock." A hush fell over the room. Ethan turned to Melissa and the other upper managers. "I've compiled everything in this folder. I also have a recommendation on how we move forward." Doug tried to muster a defense. "This is insane. You're listening to lies from disgruntled workers. None of this is proven." Ethan flipped open the folder, revealing printouts and screen captures. "Here's an email chain you sent to HR, stating that James was a risk to the company, specifically mentioning his lack of stable living conditions. You asked them to find a reason to terminate him, claiming it would save Carter Tech from liability. That's in your own words, Doug." The manager's eyes bulged. His gaze darted around the room, looking for any ally, but he found only disapproving stares. Melissa leaned over, scanned the email chain, and her lips tightened in anger. The entire audience watched, breath bated, as the weight of Doug's wrongdoing became undeniable. Finally, Doug snapped, "So what? He was a ticking time bomb. If something happened to him on the premises—" Ethan cut in with cold precision. "If something happened, it would be because you fostered a hostile environment where an employee felt he had no choice but to remain here. You fired him for daring to stand up to you. That ends now." Doug's defiance seemed to evaporate, replaced by a trembling panic. You don't have the authority to—" "I own this company," Ethan said, voice sharp as a knife. "I have every authority. Doug, you're terminated, effective immediately." A collective exhale swept the room. Some employees actually cheered, while others simply watched in stunned amazement as Doug's face drained of color. He looked around, desperate to find some form of support, but found none. Then, in a final act of pathetic bravado, he sneered, "You'll regret this. You don't know how this place really operates. I was the one keeping these slackers in line." Ethan, unflinching, responded, "We don't run a sweatshop. We run a tech solutions company built on the principles of innovation and respect. People like you who abuse their power have no place here." Melissa snapped her fingers, calling, "Security over." Doug's furious protests echoed in the hall as two security officers escorted him out of the room. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the sounds of relieved exhalation. Then Ethan turned to the crowd. "I owe all of you an apology. I built this company with the hope that it would be a place of fairness and opportunity. It's clear to me that we've fallen short, but I give you my word, from now on, that will change." He caught sight of James standing in the doorway. Pale and cautious, James had entered during the commotion, perhaps drawn by the noise. Ethan beckoned him forward. With hesitant steps, James approached the front of the room. A hush fell again. As employees realized the central figure in this drama had arrived, Ethan spoke gently. "James, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you felt so trapped you had to live here instead of asking for help. That's not on you. That's on us. You deserved better." James swallowed hard, tears welling in his eyes. I just didn't think anyone cared." Ethan shook his head firmly. "We do. And I personally want to offer you not just your job back, but a position that recognizes your skill. A place where you can work without fear of harassment, with a wage that allows you a decent living. We'll also work with you to find proper housing, effective immediately." A stunned hush, followed by a wave of applause, swept through the room. James looked down, wiping his eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. Employees reached out, patting his shoulders, offering words of congratulations. The entire room felt charged with a new sense of unity. Ethan exhaled, his chest loosening from the tension that had gripped him for days. He caught Melissa's eye. She nodded in approval and began addressing the employees about immediate policy changes, while Ethan guided James aside for a private word. This was the moment Ethan had envisioned from the start. An open, public confrontation that not only toppled Doug, but also showed every employee that they weren't alone. Justice had been served, and Carter Tech could finally begin to heal. Yet, as the employees dispersed, chattering excitedly, Ethan knew that the real work was only beginning. He would have to rebuild trust, revamp HR policies, and ensure that no one else ever endured what James had suffered. But for this day, in this moment, the victory felt sweet. The call center had witnessed a reckoning, and the man who once lived in its shadows had stepped into the light, vindicated at last. The crowd slowly disbanded, relieved yet still processing what had just happened. The tension that had plagued the call center for months seemed to lift, as if someone had finally opened a window to let stale air out. James found himself surrounded by co-workers congratulating him, apologizing that they hadn't done more sooner. He gave them small smiles, accepting their words with a mixture of gratitude and shell shock. For Ethan, the scene felt both triumphant and humbling. Even though he had orchestrated this confrontation, the fact remained that Doug's tyranny had thrived unnoticed by upper management. That was a failure on Ethan's part, something he was determined to rectify immediately. He took James aside, to a quieter corner. "I meant what I said up there," Ethan told him, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Not just about the job, but about housing too." James's eyes were still moist, and his voice trembled slightly. I don't know what to say. Thank you." "Let's call it a fresh start," Ethan replied softly, offering a reassuring nod. "You've more than earned it with your hard work." In the background, Melissa and other senior figures organized a smaller, private meeting to address the immediate next steps. Ethan, sensing James's nerves, invited him along. "You should be part of this conversation," he said. "After all, your input will help us create a workplace that's actually fair." James agreed hesitantly, following Ethan into a nearby conference room. As they settled around the large table, Melissa opened a folder of her own. "First, we need to handle HR's failure to act on previous complaints against Doug. Second, we need to ensure every manager in this company understands that employee well-being isn't optional. It's essential." The heads of various departments nodded. One of them, a stern-faced man named Gerard, spoke up. "We also need to address housing assistance for employees in crisis. If James slipped through the cracks, who's to say there aren't others on the verge?" Melissa scribbled a note. "Exactly. We might need to partner with local programs that help people find affordable housing, or possibly develop an in-house emergency fund. It'll take time, but it's doable." James sat quietly, listening, still absorbing the fact that the very company he'd felt so estranged from was now discussing ways to protect employees like him. Ethan cleared his throat. "I'd also like to see a formal system put in place for employees to safely report any kind of harassment or financial hardship without fear of retaliation. And we need to re-examine our pay scales to ensure they're in line with the cost of living, especially in this city." A chorus of agreement filled the room. It was a constructive meeting, not bogged down by technicalities, but guided by genuine concern and a desire to make immediate improvements. James, encouraged by the supportive environment, mustered enough courage to share some specifics of his struggle. He detailed how a medical emergency in his family had drained his savings, and how he'd been forced out of his apartment when the rent skyrocketed. He explained that he'd tried to secure a raise or promotion, but Doug repeatedly sidelined his efforts. The more James spoke, the more resolute everyone in the room became. By the end of the discussion, they had a preliminary plan: HR reforms, an anonymous complaint hotline, mandatory leadership training, and immediate exploration of housing assistance partnerships. But Ethan knew words alone wouldn't cut it. Action and follow-through would be everything. As the meeting wrapped up, Ethan caught James by the arm. "Before we finalize anything, I want you to know that your position here is secure," he said, voice gentle yet firm. "We're going to draft a formal offer that reflects your experience and performance. In addition, I'll have someone reach out to help you find a place to stay tonight, maybe even something more long-term." James blinked in disbelief, tears threatening to fall again. I don't have the words. It doesn't feel real." Ethan offered a small, understanding smile. "Believe it. And if anyone gives you trouble, they'll answer to me personally." With that, the tension that had gripped James's shoulders seemed to ease, at least a little. He exhaled, shoulders sagging in relief. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. The company that had been his lifeline, and sometimes his prison, was finally showing him the dignity he'd deserved all along. News of Doug's firing spread fast, fueling office chatter for days. Some employees were stunned by the sudden change in management, while others felt a wave of hope. Productivity even saw a slight uptick, as if a collective weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Ethan spent the next week fully embedded in the call center, observing, talking to people, and making sure the culture shift was genuine. He held brief one-on-one chats with those who had been under Doug's heel, reassuring them that they could trust the new system. It was exhausting but necessary work, and each time Ethan saw James's desk, now cleared of blankets and overnight bags, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, Ethan found James taking a call with a bright, welcoming tone that hadn't been there before. After the call ended, James turned to see Ethan and smiled. "Hey," he said, voice lighter than Ethan had ever heard it. "Things feel different now." Ethan nodded. "They should. I want you to feel like this place is worth investing your time and energy in." James glanced around at the newly energized atmosphere. "For the first time, I actually do." In the days that followed, Ethan facilitated James's move into a modest but comfortable studio apartment. It wasn't luxurious, but it was a world away from sleeping in a car. James received a small advance on his new salary, enough to cover rent deposits and basic furnishings. The gratitude in his eyes whenever he crossed paths with Ethan spoke volumes. Meanwhile, employees began to openly share more positive interactions. A sense of camaraderie replaced the old tension. People started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the high-ups actually cared about them. For Ethan, that transformation was the real victory. Beyond firing Doug or giving James a place to live, it was about reviving the heart of the organization. Of course, there were pockets of skepticism. Some folks doubted the changes would last, suspecting that once the spotlight faded, the old hierarchies would creep back in. Ethan recognized that cynicism was earned. Only consistent, transparent leadership would dispel it. So he kept at it, ensuring the new protocols were enforced. The open-door policy with HR was real, and that employees were treated fairly. Throughout this rebuilding phase, James became a symbol of resilience and possibility. His story circulated among teams, inspiring others to speak up about smaller issues they'd been ignoring. If James could stand up for himself, they reasoned, then maybe we can too. The wave of empowerment led to a more collaborative workplace, where managers were more cautious with their tone and employees felt emboldened to share ideas that could improve processes. The final shift occurred when James received a note from a longtime customer praising his exceptional service. The letter was forwarded to Ethan, who read it aloud during a brief staff gathering. "James has single-handedly restored my faith in this company's customer service. He went above and beyond to solve my issue, and I've never felt more valued as a client." The applause that followed was heartfelt, and Ethan made sure James stood in front of everyone to receive the recognition he had long deserved. That day, as the applause faded, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the drastic change that had taken place in such a short time. Doug was gone. James was on the path to rebuilding his life. Employees felt seen. And for the first time in a while, Ethan felt like the company he'd founded was living up to its original promise. When the day ended, Ethan caught James by the exit. "How's the new place?" he asked, genuinely curious. A slow smile crept across James's face. "It's small, but it's mine. Feels good not to wake up stiff from a car seat." Ethan nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. "Glad to hear it. That's how it should be." There was a pause, and James reached out his hand for a shake. "Thank you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Not just for everything you did, but for actually caring." Ethan shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for not giving up," he replied. "On yourself, or on this place." They parted ways, each man changed by the experience. Ethan headed to his office, where he'd continue drafting the next steps for reform. And James walked off with newfound confidence, his eyes forward, no longer overshadowed by the burden of being unseen. Outside, the evening sky glowed with the promise of a better tomorrow. It was in many ways just another workday, but for the folks in this call center, it felt like the start of a new era, one where no one would ever have to sleep at a desk again, and where no tyrant could treat hard-working employees like disposable cogs. That was a win worth celebrating. Days later, employees filed into their familiar cubicles, but the energy crackled with a renewed sense of hope. Some floors had organized potlucks, while others planned small get-togethers after work to foster team spirit. James, stepping into his newly decorated workspace, complete with a potted plant someone had gifted him, could hardly recognize the place. The call center wasn't just a building anymore. It felt like a community. And that was precisely what Ethan had wanted all along. In a spontaneous gesture of gratitude, a group of employees approached James with a welcome basket for his new apartment. It wasn't lavish, just a collection of groceries, cleaning supplies, and small decorative items, but the gesture nearly brought him to tears. He'd never felt so supported. During a quick break, Ethan caught up with James. "How are you settling into your new role?" James had been promoted to a team lead position, where he could mentor new hires, something he excelled at, given his own experiences. "Honestly," James said, "it's incredible. I never thought I'd be on the management track." He chuckled. "Real management, that is, not the kind Doug practiced." Ethan cracked a smile. "You've earned it. People look up to you, and not just because of your work ethic. You've been through hell and came out stronger. That counts for something." James nodded, his gaze drifting across the room where co-workers chatted happily. He took a moment before speaking again. "You know, if you had never come here undercover, I'd probably still be stuck in that loop, working all day, sleeping in my car, or sneaking into the building at night." His tone was grateful but tinged with lingering sadness. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. "I wish I'd known sooner. It shouldn't have taken an undercover visit. But I promise you, we're putting safeguards in place so no one falls through the cracks again." They stood in companionable silence, taking in the bustle of the department. This was the direct result of collective action, led by a CEO who dared to see his employees' reality firsthand, but sustained by the courage of people like James. Later that day, an impromptu celebration was held in the break room. Just coffee, donuts, and a quick toast to new beginnings. Melissa spoke briefly, acknowledging the rough patch the company had gone through. "Let this be a lesson," she said, "that every voice matters. This is how we grow, by looking out for one another." Applause filled the room. Ethan took a step forward. "I want to echo what Melissa said. I started Carter with big dreams. But somewhere along the line, we lost sight of the individual. I've seen now that it's the people who make this company great. And if we're not caring for them, we're not just failing as a business. We're failing as human beings." The cheers that followed were genuine and heartfelt. James stood quietly at the edge of the group, sipping coffee, his eyes brimming with an emotion that was part relief, part joy. There, among the crowd, the formerly invisible employee found his place in the spotlight, not because of pity, but because of well-earned respect. When the gathering dispersed, Ethan made his way to James. "I know you've been through a lot," Ethan said. "If you ever need anything, more flexible hours, help with finances, personal days, just say the word. We can't have a repeat of what happened before." James nodded, lips pressed tight in an attempt to contain his gratitude. "I appreciate that," he murmured. "Really, I do." Over the next few weeks, the shift in company culture became more evident. Monthly check-ins between employees and HR were established, ensuring that any sign of burnout or personal crisis could be caught early. Team leaders were encouraged to think proactively about their people's well-being. Ethan, for his part, spent more time on the front lines than in his executive suite. He would pop in unexpectedly, not in disguise this time, but openly as the CEO who wanted to stay connected. Each visit reinforced the bond between leadership and staff, reminding everyone that this wasn't just a publicity stunt, it was the new normal. Slowly, employees who had left under Doug's regime heard about the changes and reached out. Some were invited back with better roles, others simply expressed relief that the toxic environment was gone. The swirling negativity that once shadowed the call center began to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of loyalty and pride. Through it all, James blossomed in his leadership role. He mentored new hires with patience and empathy, knowing, better than anyone, the toll stress could take. One day, a new recruit asked him how he stayed so calm under pressure. James paused, remembering the many nights he'd spent sleeping in the office. Fearful of Doug's wrath and uncertain of the future, he took a breath and said, "When you've been at rock bottom, everyday challenges don't seem quite so daunting. But more importantly, I have support here now. That makes all the difference." It was a simple statement, but one that encapsulated the monumental shift in the workplace. Support, something that had been missing before, was now the bedrock of their new environment. Still, not everything was perfect. Some managers resisted the changes, grumbling that they were being watched too closely. A few employees struggled to adapt to the new accountability measures. But Ethan was prepared to face those challenges head-on. With James and many others setting an example, the company had a fighting chance to ensure that what happened under Doug's rule would never happen again. Late one evening, Ethan finished up some paperwork and decided to do a quick walkthrough of the floor. The final calls of the day were wrapping up, and he noticed James, now the last person seated, tidying up his desk. There was no blanket, no anxious posture, just a man calmly preparing to go home. Ethan stepped up and quietly asked, "Long day?" James nodded, "But a good one." He turned off his computer and stood, a small grin tugging at his lips. "I'm heading to my apartment. I've got a real bed waiting for me now." The simple words carried a weight of triumph that left Ethan momentarily speechless. He clapped James on the shoulder. "Enjoy your night, James. You've earned every bit of peace you can get." And with that, James walked out the door, head held high, leaving Ethan alone on the quiet floor. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, reflecting off rows of cubicles, once a testament to a cold, uncaring system, now a place that held the promise of second chances. Ethan lingered, letting the stillness remind him of how far they'd come. In that moment, he felt not just proud, but profoundly grateful. Because in saving James, in standing up against the toxic leadership that had nearly broken him, the company had saved itself too. And as he finally left, switching off the last light, Ethan couldn't help but smile. The future felt bright, and for the first time in a long while, that optimism was grounded in real, meaningful change. Before dawn the next day, James woke, in his own bed, still a novelty for him, and realized he had a reason to get up that felt different from the weeks prior. No longer did he dread Doug's piercing gaze or the inevitable humiliation that awaited him. Instead, he looked forward to leading his team, guiding new hires, and maybe even finding moments to innovate processes. He wasn't just an employee anymore. He was part of the company's renewed spirit. That same morning, Ethan headed into the office earlier than usual. His reflection in the rearview mirror caught his eye. The lines of worry and guilt he'd worn for weeks seemed to have eased slightly. There was still work to be done, lots of it, but he felt more certain than ever that Carter Tech was on the right path. Throughout the day, good news trickled in. A few disgruntled clients who had threatened to take their business elsewhere wrote in to say they were impressed by the recent improvements in customer service. Employee turnover, once a constant churn, had noticeably slowed. Word was spreading that Carter Tech was serious about reforming its culture. By mid-afternoon, Ethan sat in on a training session for new managers. He watched with pride as the instructor emphasized respect, communication, and empathy, all values that had been sorely lacking under Doug's rule. Then, a moment of serendipity. James walked in to demonstrate how he handled difficult calls. He shared strategies that focused on patience and understanding, but he also emphasized the importance of workers feeling supported by their supervisors. His demonstration earned him applause, and Ethan made sure to join in, letting James see that his CEO valued his insights. Afterward, they chatted briefly in the hallway. "You're a natural leader," Ethan commented. James shrugged, a little bashful. "I just treat people the way I wish I'd been treated." "That's the best kind of leadership," Ethan replied, smiling. They parted ways, each with a renewed sense of purpose. Late that evening, Ethan found himself in his office, finishing up reports. A knock on the door startled him from his concentration. It was Melissa. "I wanted to update you on the HR investigation," she said. "There's enough evidence to suggest Doug's mismanagement violated multiple company policies, and potentially some labor laws." Ethan nodded grimly. "I suspected as much. Have the employees been formally notified of their right to speak, out without retaliation?" "Yes," Melissa confirmed. "We're also working on restitution for those who were underpaid for overtime, and we've made it clear that anyone facing financial hardship can reach out for confidential assistance." Ethan leaned back in his chair, releasing a pent-up sigh. "Good. Let's keep the momentum going." Melissa left, and Ethan gazed out the window at the city lights. He wondered how many other CEOs had employees sleeping in their cars, how many other Dougs were out there exploiting vulnerable people. He couldn't change the entire corporate world, but he could change his corner of it. And that, he decided, was a pretty good start. Over the next few weeks, James continued to thrive. He formed a small mentorship circle, guiding entry-level staff through the challenges of call handling and helping them navigate the improved internal channels if issues arose. His humility and first-hand experiences earned him respect far beyond his title. Meanwhile, Ethan dedicated resources to philanthropic initiatives aimed at housing support in the local community. Carter Tech began sponsoring workshops on financial literacy, debt management, and crisis support, services open to all employees, no questions asked. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and there were days when old habits died hard. Some managers had to be reminded, sternly, of the new policies. Some employees tested boundaries, uncertain if the promises of a more caring workplace were real. But as the weeks rolled into months, the shift took root. One morning, James arrived early to set up a new training module. He turned on the lights, recalling the many times he dreaded the flickering illumination that signaled another endless shift under Doug's tyranny. Now, he felt a warmth in those same lights, a sense that this was a place where he belonged, where he could continue to grow. Ethan, also arriving early, popped in. "You beat me here again," he joked. James grinned. "Old habits die hard, I guess, but at least I won't be sleeping under my desk when I leave." They shared a laugh, the kind of moment that symbolized just how drastically things had changed. Ethan took a moment to look around, noticing the small touches James had added to the training space. Motivational quotes on the walls, a coffee station stocked with decent beans, comfortable seating arranged in a circle. It felt welcoming, encouraging, dialogue rather than dictation. "This is great," Ethan said. genuinely impressed. It's a far cry from Doug's approach, that's for sure. James sobered at the mention of Doug. I still have nightmares about him sometimes, he admitted quietly. But it's getting better. Knowing he's gone and that this place won't tolerate another Doug helps. Ethan reached out and gave James's shoulder a squeeze. That's what we're working for. A place where no one is too afraid to speak up and no one falls through the cracks. James nodded, eyes shining with determination. I never thought I'd see the day, but I'm glad it's here. With that, they turned their attention to setting up the training materials, each man buoyed by the unspoken acknowledgement of how far they'd come together. The call center was no longer just a hub of phones and computers. It was a testament to the power of empathy and direct action. And as the morning light filtered through the windows, dust motes dancing in the beams, it felt like a new dawn for everyone at Carter Tech. A dawn of genuine compassion, shared responsibility, and the unshakable belief that every person deserved a safe, supportive place to work. In that moment, both Ethan and James silently thanked fate for aligning their paths, because sometimes it takes a hidden crisis to reveal the broken parts of a system, and it takes committed, caring people to fix them once and for all. Before the first calls rolled in, Ethan decided to say a final few words to James. I just want you to know that everything we've done, the new policies, the managerial training, the support funds, it all started because of your courage, he said quietly, voice tinged with emotion. If you hadn't stood up, hadn't confronted, Doug, we might still be running things in the dark. James searched Ethan's face, grappling with conflicting emotions. I was terrified, he admitted. I thought speaking up would just make things worse. But you still did it, Ethan replied. And that changed the course of this company. I owe you a debt of gratitude. James smiled softly, still unused to such praise. You owe me nothing, he said. You gave me my life back. That's enough. From across the room, a few early arrivals glanced at them, smiling in silent camaraderie. The transformation, from a poisonous environment to a space where even eye contact and a nod could convey respect, was tangible. James left to finalize the training session, while Ethan made his way to his office. He passed by rows of cubicles where employees were already settling in for the day, sipping coffee and exchanging friendly banter, a stark contrast to the tense silences that once defined the department. Just as Ethan was about to slip into his office, he noticed a handwritten letter on his desk, folded neatly. His name, Ethan Carter, was penned in careful script. He opened it, discovering it was from a long-time employee who, until recently, had been too afraid to speak out against Doug's tactics. The letter detailed gratitude for the changes, praising the new sense of community and fairness. The writer confessed that they'd considered quitting more than once, but now felt hopeful enough to stay. Ethan felt a rush of warmth, tucking the letter safely into a drawer. Each act of kindness or gratitude from his employees reaffirmed his commitment to ensuring the changes were permanent. It wasn't about ego, it was about moral responsibility. Settling into his chair, Ethan glanced out the window at the bustling city below. He recalled the day he first arrived in the call center as Eli, uncertain and nervous. The memory now felt distant, almost surreal, as if it had happened in another lifetime. He had achieved what he set out to do, expose the cracks in his company's structure and bring them into the light. But he also recognized that vigilance would be key moving forward. Reforms could slip away if leaders turned complacent, so he resolved to keep a pulse on the front lines, to remain accessible, and to never forget James's story, or the stories of others who might be quietly struggling. A light knock on the door broke his reverie. It was Melissa, holding a folder of documents. Got a minute to review the new HR guidelines? She asked. Ethan nodded, gesturing for her to come in. As they pored over the documents, finalizing details and discussing implementation timelines, Ethan's phone buzzed with a string of positive updates. A new partnership with a local community center, improved employee satisfaction metrics, and a successful pilot of the anonymous reporting system. The waves of good news kept coming, each one reinforcing the notion that the cultural shift was real and growing stronger by the day. Once they finished, Melissa left, and Ethan couldn't resist scrolling through emails. He spotted one from James, subject line, "New mentorship program ideas." With a grin, Ethan opened it and quickly scanned the contents. James had drafted a proposal for a volunteer mentorship program where senior employees guided new hires, focusing not just on job skills, but also on personal development. The email ended with, "I believe we can make a real difference here, just like you made for me." Ethan typed a swift reply, giving James the green light to present his idea to the leadership team. After hitting send, he leaned back, imagining how James must be feeling, no longer trapped in a bleak cycle, but bursting with ideas to help others. The sense of pride welling inside Ethan was bittersweet. He wished James had never endured such hardship. But at the same time, he recognized that James's journey was now an integral part of Carter Tech's identity. His resilience was a beacon, proving that even in the darkest scenarios, empathy and decisive action could bring about healing. In a final moment of reflection, Ethan closed his laptop and gazed around the office. The walls bore no trace of the tension that once clung to them like a stubborn stain. Instead, the space felt open, airy, like a place where people could breathe easy. He remembered the countless nights James must have spent huddled at a desk, frightened of being discovered, unsure if he'd have a job the next day. That haunting image sparked a promise in Ethan's mind. Never again would he allow someone to suffer so quietly under his watch. He would be present, engaged, and proactive, ensuring that compassion remained the cornerstone of Carter Tech. Somewhere in the labyrinth of cubicles, James was readying for a team meeting, a leader in his own right. And out in the city, there might be others like him, clinging to fragile hope, praying their companies would see them as more than just cogs in a machine. Ethan couldn't fix every company, but he could set an example. If even one more CEO heard about James's story and decided to investigate their own workplace, it might save countless lives from the spiral of homelessness or exploitation. And that, Ethan thought, made every step of his undercover journey worth it. Slowly, the office day began in full swing. Voices rose and fell with fresh energy. The phones rang with new opportunities, and colleagues collaborated in a spirit of true partnership. Within that vibrant chorus, the memory of Doug's cruelty and James's struggle served as a steadfast reminder. A company is only as strong as its capacity to care for the people who power it. Ethan left his office to join that chorus, determined never to let such negligence creep in again. In every handshake, every staff huddle, and every policy decision, he carried James's story, forging a future where no one, not at Carter Tech, nor anywhere he could influence, would ever be forced to hide their hardships in the shadows. And in that unwavering commitment, he found the true meaning of leadership.